He was glad that Julian was better. As the darkness of the early evening stole away, the weak afternoon light candles flickered into life by themselves around the arithmancy classroom. Rufus Lestrange, doodling on his parchment as Professor Crowfoot wrote out the Fibonacci series and the Viking runic numerals, drawing lines between the two, looked up briefly, catching Septimus's eye for a moment, then looked back down. Crowfoot then wrote out the runes, telling the class his interpretation of each, before pausing, his gimlet eyes noticing Rufus's absorption of a point that he made. He coughed, clearing his throat before wrinkling his nose under his glasses before pushing them up his nose with his wrist. Septimus had lost track of the point that the stern Scottish professor was trying to make about the numbers. But he knew that Professor Crowfoot knew that Rufus Lestrange was not only listening to every word but analyzing it and processing it at speed, in the same way he did with conversations amongst people when he listened to his portable pensieve, a device now not only banned at Hedgewood's following last Saturday's dramatic incident at the Lower Hunt part of the Halloween Games. Septimus noticed the professor twitch a little too as Rufus paused in his writing which seemed to be, to Septimus, sitting a table width away from his friend, entirely unconnected to anything the professor was saying. But it would turn out to be something entirely relevant, and something which he knew that Rufus, generous with his time and patience with his friends, would explain to them later. That which, Septimus knew, was an unconscious tick that indicated the professor was under pressure from the boy whom he knew may ask him a difficult question, one which needed to have a thorough explanation to hand to satisfy him, lest he lose face before the rest of the students, who would be, should Rufus be asking, listening intently to every word. "At least he's not wandering about humming," whispered Julian, grinning as he tugged Septimus's robe, who turned a little to acknowledge he'd heard, shooting his eyes back to the professor, who could detect lack of focus on his lessons easier than bats using echolocation. Perhaps he had been thrown a little by Rufus, but Crowfoot had seemed not to have noticed, for he had not boomed their surnames loudly, in his Aberdonian burr, provoking them to silence by dry-wittedly inquiring what inane activity had caused them to be more interested in it than him. It was good to have Julian, Septimus thought again. That week had been difficult, and there had been a moment, when the parents had slept overnight on the Saturday, and the non-wizards had left on the Sunday, the Halloween Games being brought to a premature close, that his friend would be going too. But he and Jason Cruglington, the older Gryffindor student who had stood up for them against Blue Wit and Stone before the lower hunt had begun, had remained at the house's table. He had nudged Septimus as the students had been ushered to their early dormitories that evening, declaring loudly, or as loudly as had been needed so the latter two students from Slytherin had heard, that it told them something if it had been non-wizards from Gryffindor who had remained, about the nature of the students of the house, and went on to tell Septimus that he had taken up Madame Lestrange's offer of developing Quibball at Hedgewood's alongside Quidditch, giving more students the opportunity to play, and even for wizards to participate in football skills, something which Darren Black had been very excited to hear. Septimus glanced over to Darren, who was, as usual, bent over his work. He knew his friend found academic work in school a chore, and rarely burdened him with offers to collaborate on homework or independent study. But he was also glad to be his friend too, the four of them together, working so hard as they had done last Saturday. Despite everything the evening had become, Septimus was proud of their performance as a team, a group of friends. Despite the uncertainties of his family, his mother working away, Uncle Kay aloof but omnipotent and his father desperately ill, he felt he had fitted in well with them all, and they with him, and each other. They could accommodate differences, wordlessly help and generally have a good laugh talk there. He was lucky to have his friends. And the week at school had passed almost as any other since September, work in lessons, Quidditch to watch or, if you were lucky, to play with, now a group growing almost daily to meet with Jason Cruglington for Quibball. They had walked the grounds to the Quidditch pitch the day before, their friendship no worse for wear in light of the previous weekend, and then on to the Owlery to reward Doriel with a couple of mice that Rufus had retrieved live from the mouse traps in the greenhouses, taking bets on which would be eaten first. They had also had no bumpings into from Fraser Blewett or his friends. Uncannily normal, or as normal as a week at a wizarding school could be, of course. It had seemed as if their lives at school had been parted last week at the Halloween games, but parted like water in a bowl, only to rejoin seamlessly once the disturbance had been eliminated. Number 21, which, as you can no doubt see. And it wasn't as if the other students wouldn't be returning. The headmaster had allowed Uncle K to explain that the non-wizards were seeking respite and complementary learning in non-wizard schools before then. The Futhark, almost entirely absent in Danish, as is the number 55. However, if, as the Daily Prophet had suggested, and it had been suggested with an illicit part copy carefully hidden behind a loose brick in the Gryffindor common room's fireplace that had entered the school via Seamus Finnegan's parcel from home, which could have been mistaken for a Red Cross emergency parcel and had taken 7 owls to reach the school, there were distinct wizard and non-wizard communities beginning to develop in the country. The newspaper had, in large, bold words, that facilities were being opened especially for them, and though Septimus had only caught a glimpse of the newspaper, it had occurred to him a question of how it could be that while they had been together and would be reunited at Hedgewoods, outside the school they were being taken apart. Who was right? Uncle K, whose speech had given Septimus hope that he would see Gordy Springs and Alan Mapp again, or the newspaper, which claimed that there had been attacks on non-wizards the night of the enactment of the protection spell and division had slowly begun to happen. While he loved his uncle, maybe if he was a little more like how Rufus's mum was for sport, he might get what he wanted, passionate to the point of bonkers, rather than Cleus's hard-nosed cool-headedness. But then, when he had ever known Uncle K not get what he wanted? Watching as the whole of the alphabet and arithmetical proof was explained. As Professor Crowfoot revealed the final explanation that linked the Viking alphabet and the Fibonacci sequence, he smiled a little. Rufus had his feet up on the desk, his eyes closed. He was swaying and seemed to be muttering something, but without making a sound. The sight was not challenged by the professor as he swiped his hand through the air, an act which brought the quills of his students to a pause, vertically above their papers. Whatever the reason, thought Septimus as he seized his parchment, rather lacking of jottings which might have been of some use, it shouldn't concern him, and he resolved to put it out of his mind for the rest of the weekend, focus on the next day. Bonfire night had he been back at Dalton Drive and with his family. Instead he had his opportunity to see his father and, Snape had promised, something else worth seeing. Well, if it was for his dad and would help him feel better, Septimus concluded, as the friends all piled out of their last lesson of the week, falling easily in step beside one another as they made their way to the dining hall, that was all he cared about. 88,888,888. A few hours after Septimus had eaten his meal, thinking about the flu from his mother with Severus Snape the weeks before wondering whether it would be very long until he saw her again and he could tell her about what Snape would be telling him, for it surely must be something for the better. Cecilia was also thinking of the flu, and of Septimus, but for an almost entirely different reason. That she had not been able to get hold of Severus Snape at the start of the week had been a little annoying. Now, it was downright frustrating. Her work here, however incongruous and scattered, often could be threaded together easily when the headmaster of Hedgewoods handed her the threaded needle and explained the pattern. A stitching expert, that was whom she wanted to talk about, in order to gather and make sense of the patches of logic and reason, someone who could hand her the scissors to lop off any unnecessary loose ends. Cecilia tried again with the fireplace, one of the few magical spells that she had managed in the past. However, all that happened was, as had been for the entire week, a couple of sparks, a little glow, then nothing. She let out a frustrated sigh as she lapped her room again. Having avoided lessons for the last few days, Cecilia had concentrated on her own hypothesis, in the hope that more connections could be found, and she had found it so distracting that she considered Durmstrang students would not appreciate, nor less deserve, only half a member of staff present in front of them, while the other half of her mind would have been meandering, flowing, cascading, torrenting with the force of her thoughts. A bad move, which she had neatly avoided. But she could not avoid it forever. If Snape could not be contacted, then she would have to risk, Cecilia reasoned, an owl, whatever the dangers, to at least tell him she needed to speak to him. No. She couldn't do that. It really would cause several problems and possibly would put a lot of people to a good deal of trouble. On the other hand, Cecilia had potentially the biggest development that has ever happened over a week, one that could mean Remus had his potion made quickly indeed. She could see her beloved husband well again, and they could figure out their future together. Together. Only. Cecilia closed her eyes again in the heavy coldness that was her room, her hands outstretched towards the fireplace. Nothing. Damn it. Was she not doing it correctly? Her petunia-made cardigan wrapped around her. She kept her eyes closed, trying to feel the magic that was not giving the desired effect. Inside her mind the words burned hot, in contrast to the dead stone fireplace in which she could conjure. Nothing. Serendipitous had been Halloween day at Durmstrang. A holiday day off had been granted the children at Durmstrang, and they got to choose what they wanted to do. Too many of them, Cecilia had noticed, had chosen to work, but some of them had chosen Quidditch, and an uncharacteristic, organically evolving game had materialized, where those who wanted to play had had a fly around over the ocean and an ad hoc tournament had been arranged. In contrast, Cecilia had chosen to remain in her classroom under the pretext that she could be called upon should she need to be for those students who had chosen to self-study, in case they needed her help with their work. How badly did she need Severus now? Cecilia remembered the time she was at Hogwarts. Hedgewood's, corrected herself. That she could share academically with Snape, and it had been mutual professionalism. A partnership of, if not equals, a melding of equivalences. It was knowing that she could speak to him of her research now that kept her going and was giving her frustration at the lack of flu contact in equal measure. Which had now resulted in her mind racing so much that she was fit to burst. She had so many questions with few answers, and had made little headway. The Halloween celebrations there at Durmstrang had involved the Quidditch tournament, which that year had happened by accident, rather than design, and by the late afternoon nearly all of the Durmstrang students were lining the dangerous precipices to watch the final of the impromptu tournament. Cecilia had gone, reluctantly, at Ragnhild's invitation, her mind deeply in her work, and had left before it had ended. Paying lip service to lessons that week, she had closed her door and worked, ideas flying, connections made and remade as others were broken, and Cecilia had yearned for the easy time, 8 years before, where she had such easy access to a colleague, close enough to confide in with suppositions, wild hypotheses and conjectures, met with ease by outlandish inferences and brilliant insights from Severus Snape. It wasn't exactly the same. Cecilia had reasoned that week, and she had got by knowing that she would be able to speak to Snape soon. However, as the week had passed and Cecilia had not been able to contact him through the connection set up by Regulus Black, the genius employee of the Flu Network, not able to communicate at all had become increasingly frustrating. Now, 5 days after Halloween, Shay urged the Flu to life again, to both Petunia and Severus, without success. Not even a measly spark. Exclaiming curses, under her breath this time so as not to draw attention from Ragnhild, as the previous night's tirade at the fireplace had produced, disturbing the witch from her chutney and jam-making hobby, an extension from her strange compulsion of winter storage of food that was in her culture and nature as an Icelander, Cecilia got up from her crouched position and, stretching out her legs, made her way to her desk, wondering what to do next. Or rather, whether she would carry out the plan that had long since formed in the back of her mind. Rooting through the centuries-old drawer, absently acknowledging again the fine dovetail joinery of it, Cecilia's hand rested on the pile of parchment. She would have to do this, if it was just to get it off her mind, to release the burden and to also ensure she would not forget anything when she finally did speak to Snape. So therefore, Cecilia comforted herself. It wasn't an owl per se, not one written with the express intention to actually be sent. More, it was a research chapter, to be relayed at a date in the future, one not so very far into the future, Cecilia insisted fervently, to the not yet occurred future. The shadows played on the wall as she searched the long, middle drawer before her for a suitable quill and ink, but Cecilia did not notice them now. Her mind was switching to analysis, connection, conjecture and justification as she pondered where to begin what she was about to write. From where she had left off from with Severus, Cecilia self-instructed as she began to open the bottle of indigo ink. From her supposition a silver compound would restrict the spreading of the vampiric vector around Remus's body, and thereby inhibiting its metabolism and consequently its propagation and expansion to all cells of his body. Scrabbling her hand towards the paper, she pulled at the red and white twine which held the sheaves securely, only to clumsily toss them towards the back of the desktop. "For bloody God's bloody sake!" Cecilia then screamed, as the ink bottle left her hand, skittering along the hard flagstones for a moment before smashing into a sticky mess. "God Almighty!" she added for punctuation as her eyes watched the ink disperse in oily rivulets as she pushed back her chair with haste, to make sure the treacherous stain didn't get all over her shoes. "Scourgify!" From the doorway, alerted to her room again because of Cecilia's profanities, Ragnhild stood, her arm elegantly outstretched so as to delete her mistake. Cecilia's face crumpled, shame now at not only her own clumsiness but her inability to contain her own frustration. Ragnhild stepped towards her, the witch's long limbs striding with ease over the flagstones before stopping a little before Cecilia, straining low to see her face. "Why don't you leave your work for a little while, Sissy? It's Friday night, after all. Perhaps you could do with a break? I think maybe you are working too hard. Why don't you come down to my classroom and we can have coffee or a tea?" Cecilia felt herself sigh, her frustration leaving her body with her breath. She glanced at Ragnhild momentarily before staring at the parchments, still imprisoned in their bindings, accusing them of betrayal at their reluctance to come apart for her use, and blaming the inanimate one's trees for her clumsiness with the ink. "I've got too much to do, Ragnhild," protested Cecilia as she glared at the floor where the ink had once been. "I've got too much," she added, a look of helpless desperation crossing her features. "All this work." She moved her hand in an arc at the table. "Can't use the—" Cecilia stopped. She hadn't told Ragnhild about the flu. But perhaps. "Ragnhild," Cecilia began again, this time her voice far more controlled and measured, her tone friendly. "I'd be really pleased to have a tea," she admitted. "But, do you think you could try something for me first?" A few moments later, a confidence shared, but with the same lack of success, Cecilia took her leave of her bedroom and followed Ragnhild down the helical staircase that connected the castle's many floors. A few minutes after that and a hot cup of tea, black as the witch knew she took it, was in Cecilia Lupin's hand, the warmth of the steamer comfort on her face as it rapidly cooled down. "I am impressed with your demonstration of magic." Ragnhild spoke softly, commenting on Cecilia's application of magic to her own bedroom fireplace. "It would seem, redhead, that you do possess magical tendencies after all, and you are in an environment so magically inclined that it would be almost impossible not to show it." Cecilia smiled. Ragnhild's research involved the hypothesis that genetically people who were red-headed were sensitive to light, heat, sound, and susceptible to the influence of magic far more readily than non-redheads. However, her research was a work in progress and would be unlikely to be published because working at Durmstrang was in itself both prison and a protection to Ragnhild of the burden of truth-telling, which was overwhelming to her in even groups of half a dozen people at a time. "I'm not sure my work can help you," Ragnhild went on, her white blonde hair shimmering in the candlelight behind her. "However, could you not alert your colleague? We are supposed to be sharing our research, are we not, Mrs. Lupin? It could not be seen as anything other than you following the instruction from the European Ministry." "I don't dare risk it," Cecilia replied, the steam from her tea curling away from the cup as she sipped, enjoying the comfort it was bringing. "Are there no others with whom you could speak?" "Myself? I am not well versed in science. However, Lindveld Halen? May he be of some use?" "I need to do this myself, Ragnhild," Cecilia replied quickly, almost too quickly at the woman's suggestion, as uneasy, indeterminable feelings stole over her mind as it pictured Lid Halen. She had avoided him at the Quidditch tournament on Halloween night when she had noticed that he had seen her and was making his way over to her, and she had resisted eye contact when the staff had been summoned, on 1st November, to a meeting detailing the curriculum for the students over the next 2 months. Collaboration and cooperation had been the theme of the speech made by the headmaster, Wolfgang Bruick, but Cecilia could tell from the tone of the wizard's voice that he didn't expect the staff to pay it much more attention than just lip service. He had then gone on to address the students, telling them that now it was a new season. The application process for a position of internship at the European Ministry was open, that there were 3 places available, 1 from each magical school, and he had been met with a barrage of protest at the change in allocation. Usually it was the 3 highest scoring students regardless of school, and that it wasn't fair as other schools had less ability. "And this is the only reason you avoid Lindveld Halen?" The question appeared in her mind, spoken in Ragnhild's voice. The witch smiled. "It is the only way I can think of it, Ragnhild," Cecilia replied, cautiously. "My life is confusing at the best of times." "Thus is the way of the world," she replied, pouring more tea as Cecilia replaced her cup on the patterned, ceramic tray on which the cups and teapot stood on Ragnhild's teaching desk. "The land with no magic, the physical magic, and us, superior in talent, skill and intellect, all must be represented by Europe. You accept this view of Britain, don't you?" "It is but one view." "Yes," nodded Cecilia. That wasn't exactly what she was thinking and feeling, she added to herself. "But what you are feeling is natural. You must let it in, let it run its course for its own sake. Turn to it, Cecilia, not away. It will make it easier for you, in the long run." Suddenly, awkwardly, Cecilia pushed back her chair, and stood up, pulling her cardigan close to her, guilt overwhelming her as unwanted thoughts bubbled to the surface of her mind like a kettle boiling. Of Lid, of the briefest of touches of hand as he had said hello as they had both appeared one evening, a couple of weeks before, to watch the students' training. She had been polite and dismissive, and Lid had been engulfed by students, who had noticed he was nearby and taken the opportunity to talk to him about his physical magic research. "You make yourself feel bad for nothing, Ceci. Do your best by using your energy for what is needed, rather than resisting things you believe are ... not as they should be." Cecilia looked up, her mind replaying several events in the recent Lindveld-related past which also further stoked the guilt she was experiencing. Ragnhild was right, she had to be. She told the truth, the whole truth, raw and unrefined. It was like denying the sunrise, or disbelieving in the existence of gravity. Both were physical events and would occur nevertheless, regardless of whether people believed that they would happen. And yet, under normal circumstances, a work colleague touching her hand, whether accidental or not, would not bother her. So why was this becoming something which was regularly on her mind? Why was Lindfeldhalen's presence a bother to her? You give yourself too hard a time over Remus, her friend went on. What happened to him was not your fault, she added. This time Cecilia noticed a guarded tone in her voice. She chose to end the conversation rather than attempt to pursue it. The woman had enough to deal with, eking out her research so she could remain away from society, little if any contact with students, and too much hoarding to keep her long drinking tea with Cecilia. Come to that, so had she, too. As she ascended the stairs, turning right along the corridor and immediately left into her bedroom, Cecilia reflected on what her friend had said. Maybe Ragnhild was right. Maybe she should embrace all her experiences here. Maybe they would enrich what she was doing. But she could not face the fear of lack of security, for Remus's sake, and for her being at Durmstrang. And if it made her feel more comfortable ignoring Lindfeldhalen's genius, despite having watched him teach to an awe-inspired classroom of students on a couple of occasions that week when she'd been trying to pace out her thoughts. Perhaps ignoring him was what she was supposed to be doing. She couldn't imagine approaching him and initiating research discussions. Focus. She was now sitting back at her desk, where she had been an hour ago, parchments still bound with twine, but a fresh bottle of ink in her hand courtesy of her friend. What was she to write? How detailed? And how could she ensure it would reach Cleus, or better yet, Severus? Because, despite everything, time was everything. Seconds were severed from hours as she worked, and as those seconds elapsed vampirism was, iota by iota, nanometer by nanometer, light second by light second consuming him. And that was the torturous thing right at this moment, that the road to progress for him was barred by a lack of ability to get in contact with Snape. Owl it would be, and damn the risk. Focus. Staring at the parchment again, she pushed the ink bottle back into the center desk drawer before picking up the bundle and prizing apart the knot. Then, taking up the ink and quill, Cecilia twisted the cap anti-clockwise and stared into the almost blackness of the pigment. Where to start? Assume nothing, her inner teacher-lecturer told her. Pretend they know nothing. That's all very well, Peter Galway, she told herself, masking the inner voice that had manifested itself in the form the lecturer who had trained her to teach. But you have to assume some things, for instance, a basic understanding of English, ability to handle number and the concept of ratios. Stemming the flow of an internal argument, Cecilia closed her eyes, focusing her mind on the job that was in hand. Where should we start? She asked an equally loquacious inner critic. Most people knew of magic. Most people knew about wizarding and non-wizarding genetics, in the very basic sense of inherited characteristics, and the universal link which again, in general, they knew because it was a connection between both populations. So but to start. Closing her eyes again, she took herself on a journey, quill in hand, visualizing what she needed to include there. Opening them, she immersed the nib in the ink. 88,888,888. The parchment that, after several hours, had now been constructed was held carefully in the unsteady hand of its maker. Cecilia read through her creation, her hand quaking a little. Snape needed to have this, her ideas, her dialogue, and the strain of longing that it would be so pulled in her stomach. She had begun the discussion with plants and what makes them magical. What conjurists called all magic was the magic of the earth, that which living things all possessed, that made them living. But really, all features in that living thing was subject to adaptation, via a Darwinistic mechanism. Here Cecilia had thought, for the first time in a long time, about the old place, where she had come from. To here had been a change of sorts, a change in an event in the past, and had resulted in her being in a different reality. She had stopped writing as she had thought this, she remembered, but chose not to include it in her writing, should it ever fall into the wrong hands. the energy the plants received, through photosynthesis, which was used for growth, was stored cellularly, in the chemical adenosine triphosphate in the mitochondria. Any secondary school student of biology could tell you that, and could also probably describe easily the second thing about which Cecilia had written, that the mitochondria were shaped slightly differently to other cell components, so that ATP could be easily converted to ADP and as such, release energy. The first adaptation in plants, and something that was an advantage to the plant. The more efficiently it could process energy, the bigger its descendants could grow. Plants. Why did it always come back to plants? Cecilia smiled to herself as she acknowledged the humble plant's supremacy over adaptation and variation throughout the world. Given enough time, plants would adapt themselves to overcome every problem. Compared to the sloth-like animals of the world, plants were the greyhounds, fast out of the blocks, the racehorses to the old nags. Boring as they might be, plants ruled okay. She read on, wondering as to Snape's thoughts on the matter. Present in the cytoplasm and nucleoplasm of every cell, and essentially all the physiological mechanisms that require energy for operation obtain it directly from the stored in the ATP. As food in the cells is gradually oxidized, the released energy is used to reform the ATP so that the cell always maintains a supply of this essential molecule. And now to reiterate Snape's own discovery, though a discussion of the emphasis on the biochemistry in the process, rather than the chemical composition, the latter being the professor's focus. Here, that is. And for the second time in half an hour, Cecilia realized, at the back of her mind, she had dwelt on the other place, somewhere she had long since arrived from, and which hadn't crossed her mind for months. Werewolves. For humans, and werewolves in particular, for conversion of energy to take place in the body's cells water was needed. However, the extent to which energy could move through the werewolf's body depended on the moon. When the moon was full, tides were at their most extreme and the parasite causing the effects of lycanthropy to occur in the body did so, changing the host and allowing them to metamorph into a beast that would be in a position to attack other humans, and therefore transmit the parasite. At a lunar eclipse, this effect was made worse. Much worse. For the adaptation of the parasite did not consider the host's point of view that extreme pull on the water in each of the body's tiny cells at once would cause the most extreme pain, even death. That was a better outcome than never breeding and living in a new host. Victim, Cecilia mused, as she looked at the curled writing of her hand at her words. And again, straightforward evolutionary biology, and strangely, Cecilia's eyes darted suddenly from her hand to her bed, or what was underneath her bed. Harry's potion, that which the Snape here developed for the Harry there, accommodated energy changes in the same way. The werewolf potion concentrates up and stripped water from the cells, allowing the parasite to move from cell to cell. Using silver nitrate, a hygroscopic substance, stabilizes the effect of water fluctuations on cells, where parasite usually remains dormant. The parasite cannot induce reproducing and werewolf's transformations ceased. Incidentally, this happened naturally with the aconite plant, where the distribution of the plant's seeds happened by a person infected by the werewolf parasite, should they feel the symptoms coming on, could chew on these. In the wild, this had a similar, if lesser, effect on the werewolf, but did go some way to temper the symptoms. This resulted in a now only slightly deranged, less hairy creature roaming around a forest all night and looking for a place for nature to take its course, and the aconite seeds being deposited in a new environment. Nature, and codependency of species. So why had she not got to the bottom of this for vampires? How did the natural world help them, apart from the naturally grown wood that could be ingeniously shaped into a large point by a naturally occurring angry mob, and the naturally occurring sunlight causing instant death on sight? This is where Cecilia had stopped, in the comparison and common features of the two potions she knew worked by manipulating cellular energy. still staring at the box under her bed, she went to put it away. Snape needed to have it, as soon as he possibly could. For now, it could remain there, next to the base and match for Harry, which represented her only symbol that Snape was as dedicated to the same cause as she was. Throwing herself on her bed, still wrapped in her clothes and pulling the bedding around her, Cecilia closed her eyes again. The dark reddish match potion that was part of the pair had twinkled in the low candlelight as she had found space for the parchment. Oh, Harry! If one little part of her could wish, she would wish to see if the potion would actually have worked for him. Theoretically, it should have worked like this, the base stabilizing the ATP in the cells and concentrating up the potential energy release, the match starting the release of energy. At that point, the consumption of the match potion would be when the spell of Avada Kedavra should have been cast, in the presence of all of the Horcruxes. Cecilia's mind drifted, as she thought about this, something which, after all this time, and all her thoughts dedicated to the matter, she had never considered. Was this why it hadn't worked before? She opened her eyes, and stared into the blackness. Could it have worked? If all of the Horcruxes had been together? That the transfer of energy in the spell had to be attuned, so to speak, to the wavelength of the Horcruxes together? In her mind, Cecilia visualized an old-fashioned television set, such as the one her mother had had at home. By moving the aerial, a better picture could be created. But, if there was bad weather, the radio wave transmission were disrupted, and the picture unclear. And this was how old magic works. Cecilia could feel her pulse racing at the thought, at the work of Lindfeldhalen, and the invocation of the motto in the blood. She was on her feet now, pacing. Every cell in the body had the potential for magic, even non-wizards like herself, because magic could be induced to occur. And a certain wavelength at a certain frequency of wave could on one level or another, make those gifted in using magic perform spells. As an automatic response to training, wizards can turn off or turn on the ATP/ADP switch. Cura impotenta. No power without blood. It was what Marsden and Lully, and what de Broglie and Oswald T. Avery had discovered in the old place at the time when metabolic processes in cells was being discovered, and when the nucleases of atoms were giving up their secrets. They never had the chance to bring this together with magic. Here. And she knew she was right, but she couldn't believe the extra step hadn't been taken in connecting both of these ideas. How she wanted Snape now. How she needed to speak to him about this. And more and more suppositions were pinging into her mind like popcorn cooking in a pan, and she stopped pacing, and made for the box under her bed again. There was a continuum. There was late-onset magic, some of it very powerful, where the ATP to ADP conversion was very easy. You could choose, if you were a non-wizard in a magical environment, and wizards' powers often faded in a non-magical one if they didn't make a concerted effort to exercise their abilities. And then there are those people with hunches and gut feelings. This is magic on an nanoscale. Yes, everyone has gut feelings, but only a few get them right each time, despite prevailing opinion to the contrary. For Harry back there, had Lily's DNA been needed? Maybe to get the initial batch right, or the base. But for the match ... she had been up to number 30. If she had stayed the longer, had considered the chemical interaction that took place in cells that allowed magic to be metabolized. The words flowed from her quill as she scored the words into the page, such was her nervous excitement of a new line of grabbed it out of the box and sat on the cold floor to write. Once inscribed, she lowered it, as the leaden feeling of dread entered her stomach, not stopping at her intestines, and carried on down her legs and to her feet. How could she ever overlay her knowledge of vampirism with these hypotheses? The changes in Remus seemed counter to these two potions' efficacies. Instead of speeding up or slowing down these processes, something seemed to attack the DNA of the ... creature ... the person, and permanently change them, leaving them in permanent need of replenishment. For vampire victims, or vampires in waiting, as Ragnhild had once pithily called them, the change in their mitochondria was such that removing the phosphate group did nothing for the ATP, and it could change at will to ADP. This was why sunlight killed them, an overdose of energy literally ripping their body cells apart. And why they needed blood, a high concentration of red blood cells which in turn contained iron, which could then stabilize the process temporarily. Thus, to bite and suck was the physical reaction to their bodily process, and the parasite similar to malaria, similar to lycanthropy, passed on to the victim. Heart thumping. Cecilia closed her eyes again. She could not be sure. She needed to speak to Snape. Just because there were similarities to lycanthropy, she could not assume the pathway to a cure would be the same. Her stomach lurched, and Cecilia felt slight involuntary shaking in her legs as her brain leapt over it amalgamated the information coming through it so rapidly. That lunar caustic silver nitrate was hygroscopic, taking in water and forcing cells to yield the ADP state from ATP energy flowed, and parast caused changes in the proteins in the DNA, hence a change in appearance for werewolves. This happened only in wizards, whose ATP could cope. But for vampires. For as many similarities there were differences, and like Harry's potion. Like Harry's potion. The needed a base and a match, the base changing and holding the change of conditions for the cell, like a vice, until an attack could be made using the match. The time at which the match potion was taken would be crucial, and Cecilia sank to the floor as the weight of her thoughts coursed through the whole of her body. And the reason you need to stabilize the base with the match was because the base would hold the ATP constant, to concentrate the feedback mechanism in homeostasis in wizard body, therefore controlling the flow rate of the energy. Both potions needed to be specific to the wizard's natural energy levels, and to the environment in which the potions were to be taken. Therefore adding the right match at the right time would cause an increase in energy. The parasite would be killed, but also irrevocably changing the vampire-infected wizard. She had done it. She had done it. Blinking vacuously, she ran through the process that had just occurred in her mind. Hadn't she? It was a hypothesis, nothing more. But better than she had ever got before. Adrenaline was now beginning to make her heart pump faster. It beat in her chest and she could feel it in her ears. Because of this, there might be a knock-on effect. Some of the student wizards at Hedgewood's may therefore become ill, or die. Some may adapt, and be able to do magic. Like she had done. She got to her feet, quill abandoned, halfway through writing down all she had been thinking, her hand giving up trying to coordinate with her racing mind. Could it be true that none of this had been considered before? It was true, according to Snape, or at least the last time she had spoken to him. For all she knew, he had also made progress. It made sense from so many points of view, and answered a lot of things that old magic had borne from historical and social evidence. Making herself think about this again, Cecilia took up the quill again and continued to note down her thoughts to the end. This time she did not return it to the box. Instead, she folded it, and held it in her hand, wondering what to do next. But the worm of doubt had already begun to burrow. She couldn't be sure. She needed Severus to know, for him to attempt to prove her wrong, to pick and pull at all of the oversights, for she was sure there would be some, for him to criticize and for her to rethink, all part of verifying the hypothesis, to make it a sound platform for the potion. Lindveld Halen's face flashed through her mind. That was another thing. Her gut told her that that wizard should be the last person to talk to. And yet there was something about him, his character, his presence. No. She must not. Ragnhild? She could speak to her, Cecilia thought, but instantly dismissed that. The witch was not fully aware of all of the circumstances of Remus's condition. She had little experience in potion making, and she had told her to give in to her instincts. Getting unsteadily to her feet and moving towards the fireplace again, Cecilia focused her energies on the hearth. "Severus Snape, I need you." Nothing. Well, there was nothing for her to do but to keep her head. She mustn't get too far ahead of herself, or else she would end up in knots, or going off her trolley. Cecilia knew that someone at Hedgewood's, on with the ministry, or even with reciprocators. She sat back, the cold, hard slabs beneath her, and the parchment in her hands. For the first time in a long time an unfamiliar feeling crept over her. Cecilia smiled as she recognized the spark of hope, of a future in which she could be a part of a purpose. She may have done the impossible for her husband and, true, at the moment, she could not get it to the wizard who needed it. Yet. It was only a yet. Severus would have these concepts and the work could start anew. Then a thought occurred to her. Curious. Did he know? Is that was behind his non-wizards to Hedgewad's experiment? The unanswered questions. The possibilities. Her mind focused on Snape again. How lucky she was that he'd done what she'd asked, how privileged. Harry's potion was the most valuable thing she owned here, not intrinsically, of course, but what it represented. The only way Harry's base and match potions could be tested to verify its efficacy was to make it here, without the background influence of Harry, and Voldemort's choice of him, not Neville Longbottom as being the baby prophesied as being his downfall. With that eliminated, made it comparable. Not that it mattered any more, more had been gained from the pursuit of the answer rather than its outcome. What Severus had accounted for in the potion vials here accounted for the effect of all magic afforded to Harry back there as his mother. A much simpler method achieved here, as Cecilia had always suspected it would be, as here the universal link was established and underlay the principles of spells and magic here. A cognitive task which had helped to keep her mind exercised. And yet here, where it mattered little, it was still on her mind. Her original theory as told to Severus Snape back there still seemed to make sense here, that the nature of the old magic that Lily Potter inadvertently used acted like a shield to Harry. However, it was powerful enough to break through in parts, doing what Voldemort never planned, which was to create a Horcrux. The remainder of the Avada Kedavra spell reflecting from the shield spell's surface and hitting him. Not killed by the killing curse and coupled with his addiction to unicorn blood had kept him barely alive for so long, supported by his followers, but as close to death as anyone can be with their soul protected in other objects and living beings. Cecilia closed her eyes. Don't punish yourself for thinking of the other place, she told herself kindly. Perhaps that's what Ragnhild meant. Perhaps it really is meant to be that her learning there would help the problems in this place. Soon she would be out of it. The important thing now was to get it to Severus and see his take on it, to make progress. She did not know quite how she had done it, but the words of her thoughts had covered several dozen parchments. It was a thought experiment nonetheless, and no less impressive for being theoretical. Snape would be the one to apply her hypotheses experimentally, and while her body itched in desperation to get it to him, with the greatest display of will, in the knowledge that if she rushed revealing this, all may be lost. As with a wallet of money burning a hole in one's pocket, she wrapped up the parchments carefully and, under her bed in the box containing Harry's potion, placed the precious work alongside. One thing was for sure, she had done all she could now. Callias would have no choice but to honor his promise. She would be going home. 88,888,888. The clouds undulated and fought with one another, baying and rolling around as Tabitha Penright fought to dominate the nebulous surface on which she stood. Unexpected though it was in some sense, Tabitha knew that, in an overarching way, this was the starting point. She needed to decide which cloud on which to stand, to avoid the worst of it, and she had almost lost her footing several times as the clouds, like a raging sea, clashed together to the point of being unable to discern one from another. But yet, the ripple that had undulated around here in a place physicists might call the fifth or sixth dimension had not ceased, had not ebbed away as suddenly as it had begun, laving behind a single cloud memory in its wake. Whether or not it was an original one, or a combination of those that had battled, that was not a question which made sense. Tabitha's task now was to find out what it contained. As she jumped to one that was she in a place where the usual 3 dimensions applied, 50 feet from the antisocial one? She glanced to her right, noticing a figure, perhaps the figure she had seen before, heading towards it too. 88,888,888. As she chanced upon Cecilia's bedroom door several hours later, and what would more technically be correct to call the morning, she noticed a lean figure rotate the handle and press silently against it. As it was the teacher's corridor, the figure must have been a member of teaching staff. Approaching, so she could see inside, quietly making herself unnoticeable, she saw the wizard glance at the sleeping woman, taking up his wand and pointing it to her temple. A conversation, one with herself and Cecilia, appeared in the air between them, and then another, one which she and Cecilia had had a few days before, leafing amongst the memories with his wand like pages in a book. Selecting one, he drew it out at one tip, allowing it to play. "He's kind, lovely, like a little brother. He's so young. If I was ever half as good a teacher at his age I would be so pleased." "And still you smile, Cecilia," Ragnhild had observed both in their dialogue and from her position near Cecilia's door she was observing it again. "Ragnhild, don't tease me," Cecilia had chided. Footsteps. Fast and heavy. A stare in Ragnhild's direction told her Lindveld Halen had not seen her. Instead, a sweep of his chestnut-brown head, he turned into the corridor and swept away. It did not matter that she was there, nor whether she witnessed it or not. It would have happened one way or another. But it made her feel better and, at the moment, keeping her sanity while suffering as a seer of an all too complicated and interesting future which did not look rosy for wizards was what she needed to do.